Chapter 2: The Road to Dalal Street. When we had known each other for over a month, I asked Pradeep if he could arrange a job for me at a broker's office. My request seemed to have caught him off guard, and I suspect his initial hesitation may have had to do with the fear of losing a willing listener. From whatever little I had understood about the stock market from Pradeep, I was clear about one thing. I did not want to work in a broker's back office checking share certificates, settling accounts, and shuffling paper. I wanted to be in the midst of the action on the trading floor, shouting orders to buy and sell shares. At the same time, I was aware that my path to the trading ring would have to start from a broker's back office. I prevailed on Pradeep to get me any job in a broker's office. Seeing my determination, he finally gave in. He seemed to have also sensed that I had bigger things in mind despite a willingness to start small. "I don't know what big plans you may have in mind, Lal, but don't be reckless," he told me after he had secured a job for me with one of the lesser-known brokerage firms. There are plenty of rags to riches stories on the Dalal Street that get talked about often. What does not get publicized as much are the riches to rags stories, which far outnumber the success stories. People get carried away thinking it is easy to make money in the stock market and learn the truth the hard way, he said. I knew Pradeep was speaking the truth, but I did not want to be weighed down by fear of failure so early in my career. If a steady job with a steady salary had been my goal, I would have been content with my job in the chemicals firm. It was in the dying days of 1988 that I began a new chapter in my professional career. Shares had not caught the imagination of retail investors in a big way yet, though awareness about investing in them was steadily on the rise. Easy money had been made by the lucky few who had subscribed to the initial public offerings of some of the best multinational corporations like Colgate, Hindustan Unilever, Cadbury, Ponds, and the like in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The market was controlled by a group of powerful brokers who mostly speculated on stocks using their own money. Within this group, a smaller subset had the lion's share of whatever institutional business existed in those days. Other than these brokers, the major players in the market were the domestic institutions, Unit Trust of India being the big daddy of them all, and the promoters of the company themselves. In terms of the size of investment corpus, the Life Insurance Corporation was bigger than UTI, but it did not invest in equities as aggressively as UTI did. Foreign institutional investors, FIIs, would start flocking to India in a big way only 1993 onwards. Brokerage rates were a princely 1.5% at that time, which in some ways seemed justified because of the complications with physical shares. Despite the juicy commissions, brokers were careful about whom they would accept as clients, as there were many dubious operators who would sell them fake shares. These would be detected only when buyers sent them to the company to get them transferred to their ownership. The seller's broker would then have to replace the lot or refund the money to the buyer, and if his client did not oblige, he would have to make good the loss himself. That is why you needed somebody to recommend you to a broker before he would accept you as a client. Investment based on the fundamentals of a company was still in its infancy. A big reason for this was the lack of sufficient publicly available information on companies. Whatever little information was available was from their balance sheets, which were dated by the time they came into the hands of the shareholders. And few brokerages, even when they were shareholders, sent representatives to annual general meetings of the companies, which were probably the only platform available to shareholders to meet up with the managements and quiz them on their business. Still, many brokerages would claim they were the first ones to recommend stocks to their clients based on their meticulous research of companies and their sectors. A lot of what passed off as research in those days would constitute insider trading today. One heavyweight speculator cum investor cum broker of that era managed to get a job for his relative in an auto component firm in which he owned shares and traded in them frequently. The relative would pass on details of the firm's monthly production figures to the broker, who in turn used the information to trade in the stock. More than stock market professionals, company promoters used to speculate heavily in their own shares. All of them had their favored brokers, known as house brokers, who came to be known as proxies for the promoters in the market, even if they were not always trading on their behalf. A skilled market player could observe the size and pattern of trades made by these brokers and figure out if they were acting on behalf of company promoters on other clients. UTI's business was crucial to the prosperity of any brokerage firm worth its salt. Since UTI dealt in large blocks of shares most of the time, there was good money to be earned by the way of commission. But for many unscrupulous brokers, the big money did not lie in commissions. It was to be made by front-running UTI's trade. Unscrupulous brokers who got buy orders for shares from UTI would first buy some of the same shares for themselves. Naturally, the price of these shares would rise in the market when UTI's orders were getting executed in the market. At this point, these brokers would sell the shares they had bought for themselves at a profit. If it was a sell order from UTI for a stock, the brokers would short sell the same stock in their personal capacity. Short selling means selling shares without owning them, in the hope that the share prices will fall and that you will be able to buy them back cheap and deliver them to the buyer on the trade settlement day. The brokers would later cover their short positions, that is, buy back the same shares they had sold but at a lower price, as UTI sell orders in the market weakened the stock price. For brokers without orders from UTI, the next big thing to do was to find out what UTI was up to and try to copy those trades. Due to UTI's dominant position, brokers were forever queuing up at its office on Marine Lines in Mumbai after market hours. Many brokers were impaneled with UTI, but the cream of orders went to a select few. Tales abounded of how some brokers were able to consistently get orders from UTI by giving expensive gifts to the officials in the investments department. Reliance Industries, ACC, Grasim, Bajaj Auto, Century Textiles, ITC, GE Shipping, Century Enka, Castrol, Telco, Tata Electric Locomotive Company then and Tata Motors now, Tisco, Tata Iron and Steel Company, Tata Tea and Tata Chemicals were among the most actively traded stocks of those days. Nimesh Shah, Manu Manik and Ajay Kayan were the high rollers revered by market players for their ability to make or break a stock. Manu Manik was more feared than respected because he could be downright ruthless to further his business interests. It could be safely said that, as the biggest Badla financier on the exchange floor, Manu Bhai was the final arbiter of the interest rate to be paid by the bulls for carrying forward their trades to the next settlement. He had no qualms about hammering down the price of the very stock he had financed for a bull operator. Manu Bhai, who was considered something of a mini stock exchange himself, could quickly figure out a bull operator's capacity to support the stock he was operating. If an operator was weak, Manu Manik would short sell the stock, and once the operator made a distressed sale, Manik would buy back the shares cheaper than he had sold them for, making a tidy profit in the process. He had an uncanny ability to commit hundreds of trades to memory. While in the ring, he rarely noted down his trades in the Sauda pad, deal sheet, even though he dealt in multiple stocks. At the end of the day, he would get back to his office and dictate the trades to his clerks, and he had one more strong point, an excellent rapport with the key officials in the Bombay Stock Exchange BSE, Employees Union. Call it a coincidence, but whenever Manik was in a tight spot over a trade, there would be a flash strike by Employees Union and the settlement would get extended by a few days, helping him buy time. Manik was fearless enough, or reckless, as the subsequent turn of events would show, to take on Dhirubhai Ambani by leading a bear raid on the shares of Reliance Industries. The bear cartel heavily short-sold Reliance Industries, aiming to break the stock price. There are two versions of the story and I am not sure which one is true. One has it that it was a planned operation by Manik to assert to Dhirubhai his hold on the stock market. The other has it that Reliance's Treasury Department, which deploys the funds of the company in various financial instruments to get the best returns, had borrowed money from Manu Manik to make stock market investments. Manik is said to have goaded his associates to target Reliance shares, saying the company was financially vulnerable. He also made some disparaging remarks about Dhirubhai for good measure. Bears won the initial round as the stock price flagged under their relentless onslaught, but they had not bargained for an equally fierce counter-attack led by Anand Jain. Dhirubhai's key lieutenant Jain and his associates took over the position of brokers and traders who had bought Reliance Industries share and also themselves bought as many shares as they could from the market. On the other side of these trades was the beer cartel, which had short sold Reliance shares or sold shares they never owned at the first place. As the share price started to climb because of the demand created by Jain and his associates, the bears tried to get out of their positions by buying shares from the market. But the shares were in short supply as most of them had been bought up by Jain and Company, and the bears' attempt to square up their positions only sent the stock price shooting up further. The bears thought they could buy some time by paying an interest charge to the bulls on settlement day to carry forward their trades to the next settlement. They were still convinced that if they hung on to their positions for a bit longer, the price movement would reverse in their favor. But the buyers of Reliance shares refused the offer of interest payment and insisted that the bears deliver the shares, fully aware that they would not be able to. Frantic buying by the bears to square up their positions further drove up the stock price. The crisis led to the stock exchange itself being closed for a few days as the bears could not deliver the shares and the bulls would not settle for anything else. A truce was worked out eventually, but not before a few bears were bankrupted and the legendary Manu Manik forced to eat humble pie. In comparison with Manu Bhai, Nimish and Kayan kept a far more low profile. Kayan was more active on Calcutta Stock Exchange than on the BSE. He was also a dominant player in the opaque world of money market. Before long, Kayan would be locked in a pitched battle with Harshad Mehta in both the money and stock markets. It was a tussle that would alter the landscape of the Indian financial markets forever. As for Nimish Shah, he was slowly making a transition from being a speculator and a broker to a value investor and even playing mentor to some budding speculators, at least one of whom would down the years become more famous than his guru. Shah's firm, Enam Securities, was among the reputed brokerages on BSE. Shah himself had been a protege of Manu Manik at one time and had learned the ropes of the trade from him. All this while, Harshad Mehta's stars were on the ascent. He was an important player, well known in market circles, but not yet a heavyweight in the same league as Kayan, Shah or Manu Manik.